Good afternoon. Today I want to give our last in the series of lectures on Sufism, relating it to ideas about well-being and positive psychology. Today we'll look especially at justice, but also kindness and gratitude in that context. Uh, there is a tension, I would argue, both in Sufism and in academic scholarship, between internal intellectual achievement and spiritual achievement on the one hand, and then action to improve the world on the other. Uh, we, we heard a version of the story about Bayezid Bistami. There's another one about his plans to go to Mecca on pilgrimage, as is commanded in Islamic law. It's one of the pillars of Islam. To go on pilgrimage once in a lifetime if you can afford it, if you're not in debt. And the story goes that on his way to Mecca from Iran, he had saved up 280 dinars, and he came into contact with a worker, with a man who had a family to feed and who was out of work, who needed the money. And so Bayezid Bistami, according to Attar, just gave him the money that he had saved up for this pilgrimage. And the worker is said to have said, "Why don't you just circumambulate me? Why don't you go around me the way that the pilgrims go around the Kaaba?" This is, of course, quite blasphemous from an Orthodox point of view. But the point being that in this story, that practical action to help people outweighs ritual obligation. And that's a common sentiment among Sufis of the school of Bistami. There's a similar tension that has been noted by some scholars in positive psychology. So Meghana Rao, who's written on positive psychology, done some research on well-being, found that the research in that field is characterized by two distinct approaches. One is a positive approach focused on the development and testing of constructs that build positive qualities and improve the quality of life. Of course, that is the emphasis of the founder of the school, Martin Seligman, and his colleagues. She found 46% of the studies have that emphasis. But there's another way that's been taken by some scholars in this field, the deficit approach, where those positive constructs are applied to aid coping with diversity, which is about 29% of studies. So Seligman and his colleagues say that they had rebelled against the emphasis on pathology, on solving the problems of mental illness that had come to dominate psychology, and had wanted to instead investigate what makes for well-being among the vast majority of the population. But their findings are being applied by some psychologists to dealing with, if not pathologies, at least people's problems of a psychological sort. Rao notes that in the field of positive psychology, there's been very little attention to social justice, and I can underline this. I did a literature search, and her work actually figures prominently among the few to even take this subject up. She said that that one review that she was involved in looked at issues relevant to disenfranchised populations, focus on gender, race, ethnicity in positive psychology, and found that although women are often noted as subjects of the research, um, uh, critical discussion of gender issues in the literature is scarce. Moreover, uh, most of the research that's been done in positive psychology has focused on white samples uh, and ignores issues of race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. I think this problem comes about in part because I think a lot of the respondents to surveys in this field are at elite colleges. But this is a problem for the field. If you want to have a robust scientific theory, it has to be universal. It has to work across these categories. And uh, at this point in the development of the field, they haven't proven that it can. So positive psychology has also been critiqued by a younger generation of psychologists for neglecting the dark emotions and the potentially positive role that they can sometimes play. For instance, it's been argued that anger has its place if you're in a situation of injustice. Um, the question is how not to let anger take over your life, destroy your well-being, um, while deploying it where it's appropriate. And I think actually some of the young people that I've had conversations with about positive psychology, to whom I have explained my understanding of it, which is that of a layman. I'm just a historian. Uh, Nevertheless, they've pushed back. Well, wouldn't the implication be of people trying for well-being or happiness? And to be fair, uh, Professor Seligman doesn't like the term happiness. It was foisted on him by his publishers. But even this notion of well-being, of concentrating on positive emotions, on learning to get by, wouldn't it make people passive? Wouldn't it detract from movements for social justice? Uh, and So this is an issue that the field is going to have to work out. Uh, I had you read the article on Rumi and activism by Radha de Souza, and she points to similar contradictions or paradoxes in academic scholarship on the one hand and in the Sufi tradition on the other. So she is very interested in the category of contemporary scholarly activists who say that there's an intersection between theory and practice, a relationship between knowledge and action, and that knowledge is not an abstract thing, but a precondition for emancipation and freedom, uh, and who these scholar activists work for social change uh, and, uh, and insist that the activists in university positions have a role to play in social change. And that, of course, is true. I mean, there have been many activists who have been university professors, been in an academic setting. In fact, it's not generally recognized, but back in the early 20th century, the whole tenure system evolved out of an incident where a professor uh, criticized, was an economist at the University of Pennsylvania, criticized child labor in coal mines, and the owners of the mines were big donors to the university, and they had the poor scholar fired for daring to object to child labor. And the tenure system was instituted in the early 20th century at major universities in order to ensure that scholars are able to investigate these issues which have an economic aspect but which have also a social reform aspect without being retaliated against by the powerful. And so this is not a new thing that D'Souza is bringing up. She also points to, I think, an important aspect of our study of the Sufi tradition, which is, and you may have noticed this, a lot of the contributors to it were British in the colonial era, the contributors to the scholarly study of Sufism. And for North Africa, West Africa, the same would be true on the other side of French imperial scholars. And there was a context to this interest in Sufism. I mean, some of those who investigated it, I think, like R.A. Nicholson, were just, of a Sufi mindset themselves, and so were very attracted to the study of this phenomenon. Had they never encountered it, they probably would have been studying Western figures like Meister Eckhart. But it is also the case that colonial administrators in places like British India were always on the lookout for forms of Islam that wouldn't challenge their imperial rule. And that's some of the origins of this dichotomy that we have seen re-emerge in the 21st century of good Muslims, bad Muslims, Muslims as a problem for white capital, for power coming out of London and Paris and Washington. And although we're in a post-colonial era now, we're not in an equal world, and so the question of the loyalties or the politics of the Muslim masses has been pitched all along, really since the beginning of the European colonial expansion in the 1500s. So she points, she argues that often the Western academic tradition has focused in on poet saints in India and as philosophers, or rather as poets rather than as social philosophers. They were studied as literature rather than as sociology. And she suggests that perhaps this mirrors the dichotomy or the binary in Western intellectual history between the Enlightenment and its emphasis on reason that we saw with, for instance, Immanuel Kant, and the Romantic poetry, the Shelley and so forth, which was in large part about unconstrained emotions. So the poet saints were depicted as otherworldly and mystics and spiritualists, whereas D'Souza argues that if you look closely at their biographies, they were embedded in society and they had a social role to play. Some of them undertook social missions of reform. And she's making a more general point about the binaries in our study of things, so that colonial historiography, places like India, worked by these contradictions between fact and value, science and religion. She argues that the poet saints themselves would have resisted these binaries, would have seen practice and theory to be the same. Just to underpin her point that the Persian poetic tradition is full of verses that have a social critique in them. I wanted to share with you a couple of pieces from the corpus attributed to Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam was a astronomer of the medieval period who died around 1131 and probably didn't write poetry. But a corpus of work grew up attributed to him, sort of like The Thousand and One Nights is attributed to Scheherazade. And this is folk poetry often, although some of it probably comes from elite circles as well. And it got collected in volumes, which were then called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, just as there are lots of collections of Thousand and One Nights tales. Some of them omit some of the tales, some of them include others. So one of these poems in the Rubaiyat, which were first translated as a corpus by Edward Fitzgerald, a British gentleman scholar, we might call him, and published in 1859. Fitzgerald's translation, which is somewhat loose, but I think faithful to the spirit of the poetry, it went viral, we would say. It just became a publishing phenomenon for 80 years, and it was the most well-known poem in the English language for much of that time. Your generation probably hasn't heard of it. It stopped being taught in school sometime probably in the 1970s. But if you meet older people, they'll quote it to you. They'll have memorized some of it. So this is one of the poems that Fitzgerald translated, and which was in an Indian manuscript. He says, "Ah, love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire, would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire?" It's actually fairly close to the original, which was, if I had power over the firmament, I would redo it. I would get rid of this one and make a new one, which would be more noble for the work of the heart. So it's an impudent poem because its implication is that the universe is badly formed, the world is badly formed, and I wish I could redo it. And so that's kind of a slam on God to some extent. And this poem was wildly popular, was widely quoted in the Victorian era. I think for that reason, it was the time of the rise of Darwin and a scientific and more secular point of view on things. And it was interestingly adopted as a kind of motto or slogan by the Fabian kind of upper class socialists of Britain in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they even commissioned a piece of glasswork showing founders of the movement, the Webbs and H.G. Wells and others, with this poem written underneath. So its reformist and indeed radical implications were recognized in a much later time and place, and that piece of glasswork showing the founders of the movement, and they've got hammers and a globe remaking the world, is now at the London School of Economics, which was an institution founded by these Fabians. So another instance from Persian poetry from the Rubaiyat is a poem that I would translate this way, addressing it's a critique of astrology and ideas about fatalism. It says, "Signs of the zodiac, you give something to every jackass. You hand them fancy baths, millworks, and canals, while noble souls must gamble in hopes of winning their nightly bread. Who would give a fart for such a constellation? So this poem, is in the language of common everyday life, and but it is clearly a slam on the rich and standing up for the poor who have few resources, and it's saying if the premise of astrology were correct and fate is doled out by the stars, uh, then they're pretty awful stars. So again, you know, openly criticizing the king by name was very dangerous in the medieval period. But this poetry contains these kinds of critiques and these kinds of dissident sentiments. Um, and so D'Souza wants to break down this divide between theory and practice, both in the work of the scholars themselves and also how they conceive of these Sufi figures. She says activist scholars want to understand the ways in which knowledge can be empowering or disempowering. And I'm showing you the picture there of two climate scientists who have been widely persecuted by the US power elite for their scientific findings. And this kind of demonstrates that knowledge can't be separated from society and from social action, because the implications of their findings are that unless we very quickly stop burning fossil fuels, the earth is going to be wrecked. So turning to Rumi, in case you were wondering where the Sufism was, D'Souza argues that he has this metaphor that in irrigation you have water pipes or water canals that are all connected to a reservoir, and he says that reason flows throughout the entire body, giving all of the organs discipline. And in addition to reason, love, he says, saucy, uncontrolled, and restless, throws the whole body into madness. So he's making an argument that these faculties like reason and love are not segmented, they're not found only in one part of the body, but they flow throughout, just as an irrigation canal is connected, all irrigation canals are connected to the same reservoir. And she argues that a reservoir of freedom, of liberty, underlines all scholarly disciplines. And she takes Rumi to be criticizing those scholars who would like to confine their investigation solely to the realm of reason. She quotes him to this effect, telling this story that there was a grammarian who took a little boat to ferry across a river and was talking to the boatman, and the boatman was speaking in a coarse and uneducated way. And he made all kinds of grammatical errors from the grammarian's point of view. So the grammarian said, haven't you studied grammar at all, to the boatman? Then a storm came up, and the boatman returned the question. He said, well, I haven't studied any grammar. Have you ever learned to swim? So the grammarian said no. He said, well, your entire life will be wasted. So practical knowledge, Rumi is saying, is more important than theoretical knowledge. It's a matter of life and death. The boatman in this story is a stock character. You see lots of these stories in medieval Persian literature of a poor but wise man who shows up the elite scholar. And D'Souza argues that this discourse of the poet saints, was intended to elide the division between doing and being that's at the heart of academic knowledge. There's a story from Iran that there was a great scholar who needed to get his horses hooved and took them to an ironsmith. And they got to talking, and the ironsmith asked the great Muslim scholar, he said, isn't it true that it is said in the traditions that every drop of water is brought to earth by an angel? And the scholar says, yes, that's true. And the ironsmith scratches it. He said, well, isn't it also true that it is said that no angel would go near a dog, because in this tradition dogs were considered ritually impure? So the scholar says, yes, that's true. So he says, sir, I just trying to get my mind around this. Could you explain, how is it that when it rains, dogs get wet? So this kind of teasing of the great theoretical scholar by the humble ironsmith. As I said, this is a kind of stock character that Rumi has deployed. That story that I just told is not from Rumi. So D'Souza also quotes Rumi to this effect: does the painter paint a beautiful picture for the sake of the picture itself without hopes of conferring benefits? No, he paints it for the sake of guests and young people who, by diverting themselves with it, may be relieved from cares. So Rumi is making an argument that art is never for art's sake, that it's always got an audience in mind, and that he says it's from the picture that arises the joy of children, the remembering of departed friends by their friends, and so forth, that the art is always embedded in social purposes. And moreover is intended to enrich. This ultimate aim of the artist may not be immediately apparent to outsiders, but Rumi compares it to the aims of a great chess player. We don't always know exactly why the chess player has moved her piece at a particular time to a particular place, but those who know the depths of chess can understand. Likewise, an artist will paint a work for motives that are deeper than the surface ones. There's another story that I asked you to read that Rumi tells about the hero and the dragon, which describes how a dragon tried to swallow a bear until a hero arose to save the terrified animal. He says there are such helpers in the world who rush in to save anyone who cries out. Like mercy itself, they run towards the screaming. So Rumi is describing empathy as connected to heroism and altruism. He says the lamentations of the victim impel courageous intervention. So these stories of heroes fighting dragons abound in medieval literature. They exist in the Norse sagas, of course, but also in Persian tales. Rumi has picked them up not to tell an epic, but to talk about the motivation of the hero, which is to save others from their pain. Well, I'm going to stop here for this session, lest we go too long on video, and I'll take back up the rest of the lecture in our next segment. See you then.